we have a talk by Andreas Karatsolis, who is in, I always have to think about writing, rhetoric, and professional communication. I will learn that eventually. And he will be talking about integrating or incorporating Annotation Studio in design, which is an aspect that has come up, oftentimes today. How do we do that? We heard that in the last panel session. Are there considerations in thinking about how to best integrate it? Are there certain challenges in doing it? I think there are many aspects, and of course, we mentioned this morning, there's also a question in some of the breakout sessions, how do we assess, sort of what's going on? How do we get insights into this? So this is clearly what we will be hearing from Andreas. And Andreas Karatsolis, he joined RAP, I'm just using the acronym right now, in the fall of 2013. And he is, as you can see here, the media assessment specialist. But of course, he's also, more importantly, the associate director of this new writing, rhetoric, and professional communication program. So he has worked in many different areas, and I think most recently, and also that has really informed his background, is he worked in Qatar for the Carnegie Mellon University. And you probably have to explain what you did there exactly, but in working in communication, and professional communication in science-related fields and so on. So Andreas has a really rich background in communication, professional communication assessment, and he has been working with us in really rethinking how we should integrate also assessment components on the one hand into the tool, but also more importantly, how can we already start at the very beginning asking the right questions before even faculty start using Annotation Studio in their courses. So I think these are very important considerations, and we haven't really talked yet about, it was mentioned occasionally, the first outcomes of the assessment that we did in the fall. We will also do another one in the spring, and this is actually looking at Ina's and Wynn's course that will be sort of the quasi control group. So I think this will be very interesting to see, and I'm sure you will hear more insights from Andreas. Please join me in welcoming Andreas.
Thank you, Kurt, and thank you all for staying late. I didn't know I was getting the long introduction. I hope I don't have to explain a lot of things, but I am talking today as the media assessment specialist, although, like Kurt said, I am primarily with RAP, and that previous life in Qatar had a teaching and learning component. So I'm going to draw from some of the experience that I had there to essentially talk about what can you do with Annotation Studio at the level of course design. So before you even say, okay, let me use it and see how it goes, like some brave people did in the past and are still doing, think of it more from a design perspective. So I'll start by asking you a question, and that is, what do you care about? What are your concerns? What are your priorities when you start designing a new course or when you start rethinking a course that you've already taught? What are the kinds of things that pop up first in your mind that you want to think about? I'm asking a question. I'm actually asking a question. I'm not going to... Yes?
What do I want the students to be able to do, or what do I want them to know at the end of the course?
Wonderful. Okay, so that's exactly what I was trying to get everybody to say, but you said it first. So the first thing that typically we want to ask is, what do we want students to get from the course or to be at the end of the course? Anything else? Yes.
I'd like them to learn how to be their own investigator.
Okay. So this is a much more specific objective, right? So out of all the universe of objectives, you want them to be what we would call self-learners.
Investigator,
right?
yeah.
And this goes into the whole area of metacognition. I hope that in 15 minutes from now, we'll be there and we'll be talking about that issue because that's very important. Anything else?
I want them to have a greater awareness of language.
Okay, good. Again, that's a very specific learning objective, right?
I don't know how I can make them into better people.
Yeah, you can do that too. You want them at the end of the day to be better people. Nick?
I want to make sure the assignments build and that there's no busyness, so that everything I do keys into everything else and everything is vital, so that I'm not asking them to do anything that's not essential.
Good. So beyond the learning objectives, we might want to start thinking about the assignments themselves and the assessments. And are they doing work that actually counts for something? Or are they doing just busy work, like Nick says, and it doesn't amount to anything? Or we can't even begin to evaluate it because we don't know what we're really asking them to do. I'm going to stop here because I only have 15 minutes. But here are all the steps, according to Dee Fink, that are involved in course design. I'm not asking you to read them. There are a lot. But if you take a look, even the smallest things like number 9, how are you going to grade, are considerations. But we start from what I would call a rather rhetorical perspective. You have some situational constraints, and then you have your learning objectives. Where do you want to go? What your purpose is, what your goal is. And how will you know if the students get there? This is your assessments. And of course, you have your instructional strategies. How are you going to get them there? You can see that much more clearly if you think of it as a triangle. Have you seen that before? Okay, so that's a very basic course design triangle. You have your learning objectives, your assessments, and your instructional strategies, and they all interact. You see the arrows go back and forth, and very often you have people who introduce also the situational factors as something that puts a little bit of pressure on the side, not necessarily between assessment and instruction, but in the whole model. So far, so good. Now, what I want to start to get us to think is what happens in that arrow between assessment and instructional strategies, and what comes first. Typically, what we do is we start thinking about our objectives, and then we go into the next thing, which is our instruction. And finally, almost as an afterthought sometimes, we start thinking about assessment. And we think that we don't have a clear vision of how or what we will assess until we have designed the whole thing or have completed the instruction. What if we started thinking backwards a little bit? What if we started from our objectives, but then went straight into how we're going to know that students got there? How students can be evaluated on whether they've met these objectives or not. And based on that, start thinking about our instructional strategies. When you think about Annotation Studio, and I'll make the connection in a moment, you mostly think of it as a tool for classroom instruction or some strategy that you can use to do certain things with students. You don't think of it as an assessment tool necessarily, right? What if we went backwards? And what if we did a kind of waterfall that started with the results and then went straight into the evidence, the acceptable evidence on how we're going to identify these desired results. And only after that, we planned our learning experiences, our instruction, including what we do with Annotation Studio. What this does is it lets us avoid the busy work. And Nick used the same word that I have on my slide, so extra points for that. Okay? So there's alignment between our tests, our homework, our practice activities, and what we actually want students to do at the end of the course. And it helps us also clarify, explain to ourselves and to the students what it is that we're trying to get at by the end of the course. And finally, we want to be able to structure our instructional activities not just in terms of what the students like to do or what the students would probably find interesting in the classroom or outside of classroom, but in terms of how they're going to meet these performance objectives that we have identified in the beginning of the course. So when, for example, in the spring course, Win and Ina are teaching fiction, head-to-head almost, right? They might have They might have exactly the same readings, maybe even very similar types of sessions with discussion that they hold and so on, but their learning objectives might be quite different or slightly different. How does that change the way that we start thinking about these instructional activities? Does the assessment come before or does it come afterwards? There's one more thing. When we talk about learning objectives, very often we have a list of 6 or 7 things that we put in the syllabus, right? Students by the end of the course should be able to 7 things. But not all things are equal. There are some things that we consider to be more important. Language, or ways of interacting with texts, or critical thinking, or whatever that is. Now, we know from the learning sciences that when we want to assess those learning objectives that we call enduring understanding, the ones that we really want students to get out of this class, typically we have very different kinds of assessments that we give them. Performance tasks, objectives. In the humanities, any essay, any research paper, any of these projects would go into that category. We don't have a lot of quizzes or multiple choice responses or things of this sort, which are much better for knowledge-based objectives, things that you would say are in the worth being familiar with category. But the moment we start saying, out of these 7, these are the 3, or these are the 2 that I really want my students to be able to do by the end of this semester, you start establishing priorities. And thinking about assessment first helps you to do that as well. So let's make the link to Annotation Studio. That was really very broad background. How can Annotation Studio be useful? Well, most of the time, we tend to think of tools, not just Annotation Studio, as a way to facilitate some kind of instruction, right? Especially when you have classroom time dedicated to it, it becomes an instructional tool. What are the affordances of Annotation Studio in relation to your course learning objectives? So we heard from Mary, I think, I want students to develop their own voice, right? That's a very, very good, solid learning objective. Suzanne said, I want students to learn and apply rhetorical concepts in their analysis. That's a very different learning objective. Ina said, I want students to understand that texts embed cultural, historical, and scientific assumptions. All of these can be viewed as objectives that we want to assess at the end of the semester, but we have to find what constitutes acceptable evidence to see if the students got there. So can Annotation Studio do that? Let's see. Think about what we know, some of the very basic things. I'm not going to go into everything, what we know about learning. And let's think about all the wonderful things that people have talked about today that they do with Annotation Studio and how these can help support our understanding of that learning. For example, we know good assessments are supposed to be not only opportunities for students to reveal the learning, but also learn at the same time. Annotation Studio provides this layer of transparency. You can see your annotations. You can see other people's annotations. You can see your own thinking sometimes as it evolves and you interact with the text, especially if you have multiple opportunities to interact with texts during the semester. Let's think about feedback. We know that all learning requires feedback, right? But it must provide some kind of guidance to the student. It's not just feedback that's unstructured. It has to tell students and sometimes instructors what to do to improve performance. Okay? Goal-directed feedback, that's the phrase that they use in the learning sciences. Well, Annotation Studio, with all its new features, I guess, and tagging and filtering and all of that, can provide a way to see which types of feedback are more generative. The small assessment projects we've been doing this fall with Rachel, we're looking at the kinds of annotations students did in a language learning class and coding them, and eventually we're going to see which types of annotations help these students learn Spanish, but also write their essays, write better essays in Spanish. Are they asking questions? Are they simply looking for vocabulary explanations? What are they doing? Now, as an instructor, if you have a way to be able to filter and tag for these things, you might be able to understand for your own students what kind of feedback from you or from their own peers, even their own annotations, works better for the kind of learning objective you have in mind. What about organizing knowledge? We know that the way students organize knowledge influences very much how they learn and apply what they know. You must have seen those graphs. Freshmen come in and they only see, links in a linear fashion, and then as they start progressing, they start seeing more complex links, but then they can't really build this network of ideas, and experts then start making all kinds of connections between ideas, right? Annotation Studio can do some of this work for you so that you can see how to tag, how to organize ideas, and see others as they organize knowledge when you give it its social function, its social layer. And finally, metacognition, that whole idea of how students become self-directed learners. We know that students at the end of the day have to be able to monitor and adjust their approaches to learning. They have to be able to see what they've done and how this worked. Did it work well? Did I use it in an appropriate way at the appropriate time or not? Well, think of Annotation Studio as a space in which students can see their own thinking evolve. If you design the course in such a way where students have to go back and reflect in terms of their own learning experience, in terms of their own ways of navigating through the text and their thinking strategies, that's probably going to support their learning in terms of what we would call their metacognition. So what I'm trying to say is this. There are all these principles of learning that we know that ideally you want to be able to see if they are part of or enacted in your classroom. And there are all these learning objectives that you have that are far more specific than I want my students to be better people or be better learners, right? Using a tool like Annotation Studio, but designing your course in a way that doesn't see it as an afterthought, but thinking about the assessments that you have from the start as you're designing the course and how you're going to implement these assessments across the different assignments and throughout the semester might be a way to do much more work, well, not create more work for you, but to do much more work in terms of thinking how your students learn, how your assignments are actually making the work that you want your students to do, and if they're meeting the objectives that you want at the end. So here's a quote from a guy who's been very, very influential in assessment, which I don't know why it looks like that, but I'll read it for you. So it's supposed to say, assessment done properly should begin conversations about performance, but not end them. I don't know why it looks like this. So the idea is starting with assessment is a way to begin the conversation of how you want your students to learn and what it is at the end of the day they should be learning. Thinking of it as an end goal, as the end point, probably leads us into all the negative connotations that we have about assessment, something that just creates more work and you don't want to do at the end of the day, and it's just to satisfy some kind of external requirement, which is not a good way to think about it. So we have a few minutes, and I wanted to see if anybody wanted to start thinking about their own courses or about their own ways of approaching assessment for their own courses, especially in terms of some of the larger issues that might be at play, metacognition. We've talked today about the idea of scaffolding and mastery. How do assignments build towards mastery? Whatever that mastery is. It might be language mastery, it might be critical thinking, it might be, I don't know, writing or reading or whatever. Or even, as I think Mary said, do we grade annotations? Is this the kind of assessment we want to do? Do we grade people's discussions? And do we use annotations as a way to provide students with feedback? This annotation was actually very, I don't know, well written or to the point, whereas that one, don't ever write that again, right? So let's think about some of these larger issues, and if you want to bring in what you've done in your course, that'd be great. So any questions or comments?
I'd like to add, I know Wynn has spoken today and before about how much work it is to use Annotation Studio. And, oh, thanks. Wynn Kelly's spoken before about how much work it is to use Annotation Studio, and I think it's true. And I thank her and salute her for doing so despite that. Just to extend Andreas's question about do we grade annotations, do we provide feedback, to Wynn or to anyone, I'd be curious to hear what we can do, what we can build into the tool, to your point about making it easier to do this, to lighten that load. And so imagine for a moment you could have any feature you want and then answer, should we grade annotations? Because we'd be happy to try to support that activity.
Yeah.
Just to that question, you want me to take that? So one of the things I do in a system that doesn't yet have filtering, where students are writing a lot, we do it a lot in peer review, is we describe what makes a good peer review comment, and we talk about that, and there's a description of it. And then students go back through their archive of comments, in this case annotations, and they find the ones that they think align to what is good practice. And they have they can do a couple of things. They can take ones that don't do it and then ones that did, and they can show transition. They can take ones that do it and describe how they get it. But they choose the pieces that they think align to the outcome, write a reflective piece, and I get that. I don't have to go through and do all the work of sorting through all their stuff. They're responsible for internalizing that, doing the self-assessment, their own formative assessment, their own reflection, and then I grade on that. So it saves me that weeding through. The book I have in mind when I teach is I always like to cite the title. It's called Never Work Harder Than Your Students.
So it sounds like sometimes assessment is more work. What I'm trying to say is if you design your course from the beginning with assessment in mind and with what you eventually want your students to be able to get at the end of the course, it's really not more. It might even be less because you have a system. It's much more integrated into the kinds of activities that you're going to be engaging your students with and you're going to be engaged with day by day, instead of opening up each time a new possibility and one more annotation and one more thing that, oh, it's great, but now I have to also read 100 more annotations. Yeah.
You're making me realize that I've started assigning more and more reflective pieces at the end of my classes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I didn't used to do that because I didn't know how to grade them. But working with Annotation Studio and other tools has made me see that you can assess to some extent the engagement. It's a different term from what we used to use. It's not so much about how well they perform as how fully they perform. And that a well-written reflection can express that better than a formal paper might have under the older system. I'm not sure I'm right about that, but I'm sort of learning it.
So imagine that as your learning objective, and maybe one of the learning objectives that you consider to be priorities, right? The enduring understanding was, I want students to fully engage with the ideas that come out of texts, right? Out of Melville texts, right? That's my learning objective. Now, if you say, I'm going to do all kinds of things that the way that I used to do them, give them readings, have discussions, and then at some point I'm going to take Annotation Studio and also put that in and see how it goes. That's a very different model than saying, how will I know if students actually meet that outcome or where they are at the end of the semester in meeting that outcome? And is there any way that Annotation Studio, with its affordances, the kinds of things that it can do to make, let's say, thinking more transparent, or to be able to show the way that students start writing more based on the annotations of others, right? That might be something that happens. Do they actually engage with texts more or better or in more complex ways, the way that I would like to see them? Do they meet that learning? If you do that from the beginning, then actually your work is easier over the course of the semester because there's a path. It's not just an instructional tool and then you wait to see what students are going to do with it and adjust. You have a path to follow. It sounds a little preachy, I know, but yes.
When you talk about grading annotations and whether or not to assess them, for me, I come from a foreign language teaching background, and we assess oral communication. We hand the students a rubric that says, like, I'm, paraphrasing this, but like you can answer yes or no, like you understand me basically when I'm talking to you. You can like transfer what I say into your own language. You can give me new ideas. Like we have levels of how like good their responses are. So it seems like a natural translation then to take this into annotation. When you're working with literature, you're learning new language. You're acquiring proficiency in that. So it does seem like a natural. Why can't you assess that? Why can't you grade that?
So that's what we did in Spanish 3 this semester with Rachel, developed a coding system because the instructor didn't think of the assessment as something that would be happening before the course started. And we came up with a way to look at annotations and say, which ones are actually doing more vocabulary kind of work, right? What does this word mean, or where does this word come from? Which ones are doing more kind of connecting at the sentence level? What does this whole sentence, and how does it connect to the previous one? Then which ones actually engage with the ideas, and which annotations, what was our last category? The themes, right? Which ones not just engage with ideas, but with the actual themes that the instructor explicitly said that he wanted them to engage with. So you had layers of annotations, and you can parse them, you can count them, you can see how many of these end up in the little essays that they write, you can see which ones end up in the essays that they write, you can see which ones are most effective, and you can even get a sense of individual students where they start with a lot of vocabulary, and then as the assignments progress, you can see them getting more and more into ideas all the way into discussing themes. So that's a very interesting way to look at the tool as something that can inform teaching and learning.
And just on that, if you come to that, even if you come to that at the end and you don't want to make more work for yourself in terms of the coding and you want to help with their metacognition, you can say, now go back in and tag every one of your annotations and tell me whether it is one that does tag it with vocabulary, tag it with sentence level, tag it with this, and so that they assess their own and do the coding for you.
Yeah.
They had already tagged them as vocabulario, comprehension, so it was a nice sort of like, you just sort of filter it through the Excel spreadsheet that we can download for you, and it's all right there for you.
I do, in terms of the metacognition and the grading, this is not new to anybody, but I do want to make a plug for not everything has to be graded. Some of the point of the reflective exercises is so that they assess themselves, and that does a lot of work by itself.
Yeah, thank you for your comment, because I was thinking about self-assessment as a goal. And with Mel, we're using Annotation Studio in two ways. One you might say is official, and it's for the edition, and a team of editors and scholars will be using it in order to annotate works of Melville, and they will make it into the official displayed edition. Sounds authoritarian and stuffy. There you are. And at the same time, we want to use Annotation Studio as a workspace for anyone to come in and take a Mel text and annotate it themselves. It's sort of a problem for me because what I think is being structured here, and I'm not sure it's a good thing, but maybe it is, I don't know, is that the official will become the goal or the aim, the way to sort of do annotation, and it becomes a kind of model, whether you intend it or not. And I'm wondering if that's a good thing. I mean, people coming into the workspace will be able to craft their own annotations, either in conversation with or in denial of the official annotations. They can add to them, they can annotate other things. But it seems as though there's a kind of mode of self-assessment that's being allowed there. I mean, you can sort of say, well, how does your annotation relate to the official annotations? And I think there might, I'm not arguing for that, I'm just sort of wondering if that's the right way to go, or if that's inevitable, that you can't avoid that kind of modeling of the annotation. So it's a
So my first reaction is we have two very different purposes here. We have two very different goals. One is to create that authoritative corpus in some ways, with its annotations that have been vetted and curated and all these kinds of things. And the other is to be able to help students of Melville enjoy, appreciate, engage with the text, do all this kind of work. That would be a very different objective. Now, I think what you're pointing to is the difficulty of not making that authoritative text actually put that pressure on the annotations of the students of Melville, so that they feel that they have to meet some kind of standard, which already exists, by the way. So I think that that would be something that if you go into a classroom situation and you say, these are the learning objectives beyond what you put in the syllabus, right? Actually talk to students and say, this is what is important here. Not for you to do exactly the kind of thing that you see in that corpus, but actually to find your voice, engage with a text in its historical and social and scientific dimensions, or think of it as a rhetorical tool to figure out the strategies that are used to be able to make the case for whatever it is. Then their focus turns away from the authoritative text to the objectives at hand. But I think that's a very, very good and difficult question to answer.
Okay, great. I think this really was great ideas for food for thought. Thank you very much, Andreas.
To continue the conversation, contact Rachel.
Yes. Exactly. Thank you.